Absolutely. No, this is great. I mean, we've been actually monitoring this CCG also on that as well. I actually talked to the Charge des Affaires here, the one that left and also the one coming. I mean, this actually student exchange is important, and also many Chinese families actually are quite concerned on that. So I'm glad to see actually, the figure until July that U.S. Embassy here in China has issued 85,000 student visa to go to the United States. And if you're counting that probably issued in August, we probably could see over 100,000 United student visa being granted to the United States. So this is really important that we see miles long queue at the Pudong International Airport to go to the United States. So this is great. I think that is important because President Carter has set up this bond and welcomed the Chinese student, and also lately the Deng Xiaoping has actually unleashed this student study abroad movement. I think that movement has actually created a lot of generated so many benefit for China because so many talents has returned. There's a talent circulation. There's a brain circulation. That tremendous help the entrepreneurial, scientific, and of course entrepreneurial and industrial revolution that is going on in China. So absolutely. So Paige, actually, I know that you've been working at USAID for so long. You've been looking after many important projects in different parts of the world, and African, and also, of course, Europe and countries like that. Of course, China also set up a new development agency in 2018. It's called the China International Development Cooperation Agency, CIDCA, and but now I think the developing countries really need a lot of cooperation among the big countries, and particularly development agency. How can we work together? And also, given the pandemic is going on, and given that the Carter Center has so much experience working in the past in Africa and many other countries, how from development point of view, what's your take on this current situation, and how maybe in the future, and what are the experiences that maybe you have in the USAID and others that for development purpose, how can we really work together in the years ahead, probably? Yeah, Paige.
Sure. Well, so just in case we have some people who are listening who do not know exactly what the United States Agency for International Development is, let me give you a quick chapeau of that. It's often called USAID, and it's an independent agency of the federal government responsible for administering foreign aid and development assistance. So the annual budget for USAID is a little over $27 billion, and there are about 9,000 employees, and therefore it is one of the largest official aid agencies in the world. But it's important as China is setting up theirs to fully understand the history of ours. So our history dates back to the US Congress passing the Foreign Assistance Act in 1961. And that reorganized all of U.S. foreign assistance program and mandated the creation of this agency to administer the economic aid. And I think China's gone through a little bit of that with the Ministry of Commerce and then moving the new agency around. But USAID at that time became the first U.S. foreign assistance organization whose primary focus was on long-term socioeconomic development. So USAID's work encompasses humanitarian projects as well as other development work such as global health, agriculture, environment, education, poverty alleviation, and many other programs where we do this through technical and financial assistance mechanism. And because AID's an official component of the U.S. foreign policy, I say we because I worked there for 15 years, but AID receives guidance from the president, the secretary of state, and the National Security Council. We have often said that it is part of a three-legged stool, which includes diplomacy, defense, and development in terms of how we relate to all of our overseas partners. AID's got field offices or projects in about 100 countries, and all the funding going to USAID that then goes out the door is awarded completely through competitive grants and contracts and cooperative agreements. So all the information as to where USAID spends its money can be found on a handy website called foreignassistance.gov. And this is a dashboard for transparency, so US taxpayers and anyone else knows where their foreign assistance funds are being spent. Over the years, with changing administrations, there are often important signature initiatives. I think anyone listening who has a government that changes as frequently as ours does, every 4 to 8 years, you have recognized this. And we have things such as the President's Emergency Plan for AIDS Relief, which is also called PEPFAR, and that survived through 3 presidential administrations. You have the President's Malaria Initiative, Feed the Future, which is a global hunger and food security initiative, Power Africa, which was set up to leverage partnerships to increase access to the power in sub-Saharan Africa, and now COVID relief. So there are many programs I could highlight, but those are just a few which really stand out as game changers, which have stood the test of time because they make good development sense, and it's a long-term bet that we're making. So as I understand it, China's new agency provides a larger amount of development finance in the form of concessional loans. And Chinese aid, unlike aid provided by other developed countries, isn't governed by the categories of OECD's Development Assistance Committee. So it's not counted in international statistics. So it's harder for me to make true comparisons. But although China's a latecomer in the international development assistance, I know that China has been engaged in foreign aid in Africa since the early 60s, when it was still a very poor country, but there was still a lot that was being done. But China is really different today, and its footprint is growing bigger and bigger in developing countries. I think Yahweh knows as well that President Carter once said he saw the presence of China in every African country he and Mrs. Carter had traveled to. So China's really transformed itself from a developing country to a country getting close to joining the club of developed countries. And foreign aid played a small role in China's transformation. So as a result, China's in a better position in terms of how to engage in this work. But as with all assistance in developing countries, it's a challenge to coordinate the assistance on the ground, to share best practices, to learn from these lessons. So we hope the new aid agency will engage with those who've been doing this work for a while, and we can find ways to work together to help those most in need.
Mm-hmm. Great. And yeah, I think that is probably something that both the U.S. and China can work together in the future, because I know that the infrastructure now, I mean, not only in developing countries, but even in the U.S. and of course in China, it seems that the infrastructure transformation is going to be the biggest draw for the whole world to develop. And China already got some experience, and we actually set up a Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and we're joined by 104 nations already on that. And so I think also, as you said, USAID was set up in the 1960s, whereas China now have this China International Development Cooperation Agency set up in 2018. So I'm thinking, Yahweh, you've been really at the Carter Center for a long time, and of course you involved some project with Carter Center in Africa. But what I'm thinking is now, U.S. and China, we need to find something to work together. I mean, the world will probably need us, and African, Latin American, and all those areas, particularly for the pandemic, that U.S. and China should work together rather than we get into some kind of politics and trying to focus on the source of origin rather than how we can deal with the virus. I mean, that's probably even more urgent. And the world revival leads on that. But after that, we probably need more experience on the infrastructure, how we can work together. I know that President Biden has proposed $1 trillion infrastructure plan for U.S. I was talking to Neil Bush. I mean, we thought China and the U.S. could have JV, a joint venture company that working in Texas, for example, helping the oil energy export to China and work together. So I know that G7 has proposed Build Back Better the World. I mean, B3W, and of course, China has this Belt and Road Initiative, and we had actually a CCG conference just recently. Chinese former vice minister who look after China outbound investment actually said maybe B3W and Belt and Road can work together. So Yao, do you see how we can work together on the infrastructure and probably giving you a Carter Center experience on working in Africa and other countries? Do you see the possibility of U.S. and China working together in ahead?
Thanks, Huiyao, for that question. Actually, the Carter Center started promoting U.S.-China collaboration in Africa back in 2012, 2013. So we've been working in this area for almost a decade. I also want to thank you because I think you still remember in the middle of working on that, I asked you, whether you know someone at MOFCOM, and you told me that you know people at the Research Institute of MOFCOM, because we wanted to talk to people who are in charge of development assistance to African countries. You mentioned whether China and the US could work together in the international development area. Before we get into the bigger picture, which is infrastructure, I just want to sort of review some of the small cooperative projects between the US and China. I think the first one probably between USAID and China happened in East Timor. It was an agricultural project. Paige, you mentioned everything has to be out, on the competitive bids. I think a Chinese entity won that USAID contract to work in agriculture in East Timor. After that, I think US and China worked not necessarily, after they talked to each other, but also it was through a contract. It's in Liberia. Liberia emerged out of the Civil War and needs to be rebuilt. The US, China, and UNDP worked together to rebuild the University of Liberia. That's why we had one of our meetings in Johannesburg at the end of 2017, because at the time, the Chinese ambassador to South Africa, as Huiyao mentioned, Ambassador Lin Songtian, and also our Vice President for Peace, the former Vice President for Peace, Jordan Ryan, was the UNDP Liberia country representative. And Donald Booth, a US Special Envoy for South Sudan, was the American ambassador in Liberia. So the three of them were there together. So we brought them together, and hopefully they could share, how they were able to work together back then, and could they, make recommendations to the government to see if US and China could work together. So that's in Liberia. Of course, the most important US-China collaboration is in the area of public health, and that's Ebola in West Africa. Carter Center actually was very much involved, but not with China, but with CDC here. But China and the US work together. I think what happened, actually, I think, Henry, you probably want to talk to the China side to basically see how this collaboration was brought about. What happened, who called whom first. From the US side, Susan Rice said President Obama asked her to contact the Chinese government to see if China could work together with the US to contain Ebola in West Africa. So that's the American side of the story. We don't know anything about the China side of the story. And this success, this cooperation was so successful. So when President Xi Jinping visited the US in 2015, this is what Paige mentioned earlier, Barbara Smith was very much involved, is the MOU between USAID and MOFCOM. This is before China agency China International Development Cooperation Agency was formed. And so the MOU was signed. I went to CDC and talked to one of the doctors there. He said, 90% of the MOU work is actually CDC. And what did China and the US do? They worked together. They established the first CDC in Addis, Ethiopia. So this is the first African CDC. And this is a result of US-China work, in West Africa. So again, looking back and looking forward, although US-China relationship is at the lowest point, but there's still a lot of potential for two sides to work together. One, of course, Henry, you mentioned, is pandemic. Second is infrastructure. But all of this, I think, is drawn because of the lack of trust in each other, and also groundless accusation, largely from the USA in terms of what China is trying to do. BRI is a geopolitical move. It has nothing to do with assistance. It's commercial. It's China's sharp power. All of that. So I think the potential is great, but then both sides will have to overcome the current hurdles, and that's going to take time, take patience, take courage. And the Carter Center would very much like to work with your organization, and through you, hopefully, with the Chinese government, to get something going, not to build a road together, but maybe just a small pilot to particularly, like what we're looking into is if China and the US could work together to provide COVID assistance to Myanmar, as simple as that.
Yeah, no.
Back to you, Harry.
Yeah, no. Thanks, Yahweh. I think that absolutely, U.S. and China has many areas can complementary and also can really work together. And I know that in 2015, that General Electric and of course also China Machinery Import Export actually signed agreement to work in a third country as well. China now already. President Xi was talking to Angela Merkel and President Macron on working in Africa. I think Africa, now has such a great, potential. And you mentioned about Ebola that U.S. and China worked together. That could be really good examples. I mean, particularly fighting pandemic and also working on the infrastructure. China has worked on the African infrastructure. Half a century ago, my father worked on the Tanzania-Zambia railway. I mean, in the 70s, so that was something, memorable as well. And so I really think that there's an area that, both countries can work together. I think the world needs us, and the developing world also needs us, and we can really supplement each other. And the U.S. has a long tradition, but China has a lot of a new expertise accumulated, like infrastructure. But absolutely, pandemic is really the time that we have to work together. I really hope that pandemic, climate change, and all those great areas, to work together. But as you said, we need to build up the trust. Absolutely, we need to really build up the trust and not really trying to find a problem with each other and trying to really come back to the normalcy that we have actually, maybe in the last several decades, most of the time. So I know, Paige, you were involved in the post-conflict reconstruction in Balkans. You are very familiar with that area, and so maybe you could share some thoughts on those international initiative then, and also the response on the Balkan and. How that helped, and even to the situation we have in Afghanistan these days. I mean, again, we need a global leadership. We need a global concerted efforts to really make sure that the area is reconstructed and maybe put into more stable and peaceful situation. So there's any recommendation you can share with us?
Well, I had the good fortune to work on the Balkans starting in '95 when the Dayton Accords were being negotiated. I would not have guessed that 25 years later, we would still be working in the framework. That would still be the framework that we're living under. So to say that development is not linear, you don't always go from a humanitarian crisis to a post-conflict to democratic and economic programming. Often the crises happen in advanced developed countries, or the interventions needed are due to backsliding, which requires financial or other assistance so we can recoup the ground that we've lost during a crisis. So whether you're in the Balkans, Haiti, Syria, Yemen, or Afghanistan, each is so complex, and it requires a dedication and a really long lens towards recovery that can often change faster than the program work is really able to address. In my time working on Bosnia and Kosovo, I could see the issues were generational, and we knew many of the interventions needed to take time. It really needed time to take hold before the basics regarding rule of law and regulatory reforms could be put in place and show their usefulness. So Afghanistan's a very special case, which we really wouldn't have enough time to cover in this discussion, but the international community should not let its sole attention become the refugee situation. I've seen that happen in Syria as well. So we must really remain focused on those who are in Afghanistan and what we can do to continue helping them live their best lives. It would be wrong for me to surmise what U.S. policy should do now in terms of recognition of the people running the country, but we need to retain some level of discourse so those Afghans who need and want assistance can continue to get it from other countries. On the issue of the role of China and potential U.S.-China cooperation, I think it's fair to say that the top priority for China, like that in the U.S. at the beginning of the war, is to prevent a country from becoming a safe haven for terrorists. China really shares a short border with Afghanistan, and China's got a good relationship with Pakistan, and that influence over the Taliban is very significant. So I hope China, takes advantage of the leverage which the U.S. clearly lacks. I remember when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, she introduced the concept of a new Silk Road, and it's about linking Afghanistan to the South Asian countries like India economically. And at USAID, we actually were in the process of changing our Office of Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the Near East Bureau. We merged those for this exact reason, to be able to link. And if China now has the ambitious Belt Road Initiative, we hope that you could include Kabul in the BRI when the latter situation is stable enough for foreign direct assistance and other investments. At the present time, when it comes to U.S.-China cooperation, it probably mainly revolves around speaking with the same voice at the UN. Tony Blinken, our Secretary of State, and China's foreign minister had phone calls, 2 phone calls in August, I know. And the first call was about ensuring a peaceful evacuation of American and Chinese citizens in Afghanistan. And the second phone call was about working together at the UN Security Council to pressure the Taliban to allow continuous evacuations of Afghan people who want to leave, and to permit inflows of humanitarian assistance and stop supporting international terrorism. So Beijing facilitated the initial dialogue also between the US and the Taliban, and China could continue to play that role, as it's going to take some time before Washington decides on the recognition issue. So yes, I do believe that the US and China could cooperate in Afghanistan, but the devil's in the details. Yahweh just mentioned some of the successes we've had in cooperation in South Sudan and with Ebola, and the trilateral cooperation that we want on African affairs. So I hope Beijing and Washington will be able to coordinate their policies towards Afghanistan. And I do think it's in both governments' interest in terms of peace and development in that country.
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's important that we maintain a peaceful and possibly prosperous Afghanistan, so we don't let terrorists rooted there again, and also for the security of Afghanistan, that part of the region, including Xinjiang from China, where border impact Afghanistan, and you know, so it's important that all the big countries work together, and so I'm glad to see that the UN Security Council passed the resolution on that, and so that we can actually see maybe a new birth of a more stable Afghanistan, and where now they are forming a new government, and China is closely watching that, I suppose. But I really hope that U.S., EU and other countries, China, of course, that we can all work together and to ensure a safe and peaceful Afghanistan in the future to come. Absolutely important for that. So Yao, I know that we're actually talking about the China-U.S. relations in the last 4 or 5 decades. President Carter is the president who established diplomatic ties with China and the U.S. And so what Carter initiatives for all those years, and what else have you done? I mean, after President Carter running this center, founded this center that promoting the China-U.S. relations, so that we're having a complexity of the situation. We're having a lot of argument these days. Maybe it's good to look at the historical and the leadership that President Carter, or the vision he has on promoting a better U.S.-China relations.
Thanks, Henry. I know our time is running short, so I'll be quick. I think after President Carter left the White House, he was immediately invited by Deng Xiaoping to visit China. And after that, President Carter visited China multiple times. I think during one of the visits, President Carter said, now I have my center, I would like to work with China on issues. And Vice Premier Deng Xiaoping said, my son, who is disabled, is the president of the Chinese National Association for the Disabled People. Maybe the Carter Center and his association could work together. So that actually was the Carter Center's initial entry project into China, is to provide special ed education to training for special ed educations. That actually was my first volunteering work with the Carter Center, is to interpret for the Chinese special ed teachers who came here. President Carter said over 900 Chinese teachers were trained here at the Carter Center. And then the Carter Center also purchased a production line of artificial limbs for China, which I think many years ago we got a letter from the Beijing Bureau of Civil Affairs saying, the production line is still working. We want to thank President Carter for doing that. So that's our initial entry into China. Later, from 96 all the way to about 2012, I can summarize our engagement with China as telling the China story. So what was the China story the Carter Center was telling? That's the story that China had real, fair, competitive elections at the village level, because we observe village elections, and I think one of the Chinese officials said, if we say China has democracy, nobody is going to believe it. But if the Carter Center observed and then told the world that there were real grassroots democracy in China, that is credible. So that has took a lot of effort. From about 2012 now, so over a decade, almost a decade, our work largely is divided into 2 categories. So one category is about reducing misperception, reducing lack of trust, and to increase mutual understanding. So that is our online initiative, US-China Perception Monitor, 中美印象, our English and Chinese website. We also organize a high-level forum on US-China relations, which began in 2012. The last one we had is January of this year. It's the 8th one. I want to remind our audience that in 2019, in January, we're the only US organization that organized a 3-day meeting on the 40th anniversary of the normalization. No other US organization or think tank really dared to do that because the relationship was at such a low point. But we also organized a Young Scholars Forum on US-China relations. So the next one, which is the 6th one, will be held online starting September the 22nd. Now, the second category of the work we do, which is, I think, is more challenging but more significant, is to bring China and the US to cooperate in the third country. We talked about in Africa. I don't want to get into the details of what we have done because of the time shortage. I want to share a sort of an anecdote here so that to highlight the necessity. The Carter Center works in Mali. We have an international ceasefire monitor group over there. China actually has peacekeepers on the ground in Mali. And Huiyao, you mentioned the Chinese government and the French government signed agreement that they're going to coordinate their development assistance in Francophone countries. So, this is all good. China, US, and the French, actually, they're supposed to work together in Mali. That's the core of, from the developed countries like US and France and China, which is a new kid on the block. They need to talk about these issues. They need to basically, even if they don't agree, they still need to figure out, since the US, the Carter Center, China, and the French government, they're all engaged in Mali. They're all spending resources, human resources, and others there. But there is no conversation whatsoever between the stakeholders. And hopefully, again, Huiyao, you and us and other parties, we can set up a case, a pilot. Just look at the particular country where there is US involvement, where there is Chinese involvement, and we come together, both from the non-governmental sector and the government, USAID, CIRCA, whoever that we can bring to the table. And that brings us to where we're working on is Myanmar. How could China and the US, if not working together, coordinate their policies with ASEAN or with the United Nations so that international COVID assistance to Myanmar could be delivered